Hello and welcome to another Thinking Particles 7.1 tutorial video. With the release of 7.1 we have introduced a lot of new functionality regarding the material point methods, including new solvers and new material properties. In this video we will discuss how we can adjust and control these material properties. But before we do that, we will have a look at the scene and how we did the setup here, and we are trying to have a controlled environment where we can explore a little bit the material properties. But before we do that, let me just turn off Thinking Particles and show you the 3D Studio Max scene. It's a very simple scene. We have 4 boxes. These are standard boxes. One is meant for the upper hold and one is meant for the lower hold. I'll explain later what that means. And we have our material volumes. These are these center objects and shapes that will represent the volume we want to fill with particles. And those will be our material. So pretty straightforward setup, pretty easy and simple, and easy to follow up if you want to reproduce this video. Now let me turn on Thinking Particles, and we have brought everything into Thinking Particles and we can start with our visual effects. One thing to note is these different colors we have there, and they are happening at the intersection, so where the particles, our material particles, intersect these holding boxes. So this is important because we want to pull them apart or twist them apart or do any kind of manipulations to our material. So how did we do the setup? Let's have a look in Thinking Particles. Let me just bring in the user interface of Thinking Particles. Here we go. And let's start with the beginning. So the create setup is meant for creating particles. Then we have our force, holders, fixed particles, and our simulation dynamic set. So also pretty straightforward setup we have here. Let's start with the create setup. In the create setup we have the material particles. We bring them in with a layer to particle. So we turn every object that we find in a layer into a particle. So we did that with our materials. That's the cylinder and the materials are on their material layer, as you can see here. So pretty straightforward and easy. We select the layer name and then we select which objects we want from the layer. And every single object is turned into a particle along with its shape. So we can access now the objects in 3D Studio Max as particles. Then we use the volume position to get the volume of these shapes. And then with the volume position, we are going to fill these volumes with particles. Let me just turn on, show the volumes. We see these are the volumes, and inside of our shape or volume, we create these particles. Also very simple, very straightforward setup. So we fill actually our 3D Studio Max objects with particles, and we do that with the volume position. And then we feed in the position to a position born, and we born the particles. The next thing we do here is we grab the position of the particle and abuse this position as a UV coordinate. So as these positions are created, we create UV mapping for our particles inside of the volume. It's kind of a 3D mapping. And we store the value we get for our texture map in a data channel. So we just give every particle its own UV coordinate, and we store that in a data channel. We created a data channel in the material group, and the data channel is also inherited in the subgroups for upper and lower particles. So these are the particles that intersect with our upper and lower hold. However, we assign the UV coordinates to all particles, regardless in which group they are. We have these different groups for upper and lower holds, but the UV coordinates are assigned to all materials, so including the subgroups. Okay, here's a short recap. We create the material particles with our position bourne, then we use the position of the particle to create texture maps, and we assign it to all particles. The next thing we bring in is the upper and lower holds, which are also just standard 3D Studio Max objects, and we turn each object into a particle. So now we have everything inside of Thinking Particles that was in the 3D Studio Max scene. So now we have full control. We can apply forces. We apply the force to our material particles because that is the main part we want to simulate. And on to the next dynamic set. In this dynamic set, we sort the particles. Let me just disable this dynamic set. I'm going to right click on the dynamic set name. And now it's disabled, and let's have a look. So I'll restart the simulation and we will see that the particles are no longer sorted. They are all in the material group. So right now, no particle is sorted according to the intersection with their holder box. Let me just bring that back, and here we go. I'll right click again on the holders dynamic set. We restart the simulation, and now the particles that are inside of each of the holder boxes will be sorted into their particle group. So let's have a look how this works. We only do the sorting once. So we do that at the start frame 0. And then I'll pick the upper hold particle group. The upper hold particle group contains our boxes. And these are the upper boxes. So for every upper box that is there, we will get a particle, and this particle is activating the material particle group. And then we will spit out all the material particles and check these material particles with an in-mesh operator. The in-mesh operator is very simple, straightforward, but really powerful. It looks as a particle inside of an 3D Studio Max object. And when this is the case, we output the flag, yes, it's inside. Then we change the group. So if it's in the upper box, we put it in the upper subgroup of particles. And it doesn't matter how many objects we have here, because for each particle of the upper hold group, this will be done and evaluated. So we go through and sort our particles. And because this is just one time, it doesn't matter if it takes some time or some extra time to sort them. Then the next important thing is I'm already preparing for our stretching and deformation stuff. So I'll create a reference. I'll set the reference between our upper hold box, or a reference between our box particle and the material particle we just sorted. So all the particles that intersect with the holding box will be referenced to our box particle. Then the particle data, as you just saw, is assigning a mass, an unlimited mass or very high mass, because we want to tear apart these materials. And that's practically all that is here in the dynamic set. And the lower part is just a mirror of the upper part. So there's nothing really so complicated or magic going on here. So we sort the particles, the material particles, in upper and lower parts where the intersection is, and that's it. Okay, on to the fixed particles. We want to connect the particles with the box particle, so that whenever the box moves, our holder particles move as well. And this is the dynamic set. Also very straightforward. We grab all the upper hold particles and we get the reference. The one thing I explained before, we get the reference to our box particle, upper hold particle. And then we just use the p-attach, which attaches particles to each other. We use the p-attach operator and just glue them or link them together in a relative mode. So whenever the box moves, these particles will move as well. And they will move and rotate like the original particle as well. So that's actually all we need to do. And on to our next dynamic set, and this is the simulation dynamic set. And in there is a standard dynamic set setup. It's the flow MPM, flow boundary, if we wanted to have collisions with our upper or lower holds. And we have also the last entry is our flow solver. And keep in mind, the flow solver should always be the last one in the hierarchy, like we see here. And then in the flow MPM, we are going to explore a little bit the material properties and what we can do with them. So let me just reset the view, and we are going to just have a look what we are going to see here. Let me just move down and turn on the stress visualization, so we can visualize the stress. And the stress visualization is blue means it's stretched and red means it's compressed. So whenever you see a dark blue, it means a high stress stretch load, and red means a high compression mode. So, okay, reset, and let's just see what we have here. So these lower boxes are animated. It's just standard max animation, keyframe animation, and we pull the object, and the left hand is just rotating. So we are creating a pull force and a torque or rotational force here. Now, how can we adjust these material properties? How can we tell when this should break apart or tear apart? So the yield is a parameter that comes from real-world physics. The material yield is a threshold when a material changes its state. So when a material, for example, becomes brittle or liquid or fluid or soft, and that is the threshold about how much stress this can hold. And you just saw I increased the yield to 5,000, and now we need much more power to pull these material apart. And this also gives a much higher stress inside of the material. You saw there's a lot more stress distributed. Now let's do a really wild value, and there's always a limit, so you can't overdo it, because the yield, if it's over this, because we're using unlimited mass to pull on that, so we're kind of a little bit stronger than nature here. But let's try and see when we make it soft. And you can see when it's soft, it breaks instantly, and also it breaks nearly under its own weight. So the yield defines when the material breaks, so to say. We have other parameters as well, but we are just concentrating right now on the yield value, and that's the transition when a material gives. So let's put back the 500, and then we have another question. Why is it breaking up here? Like in the real world, it breaks where the highest stress is. And this is dependent on material properties. If a material has failures or little defects inside of the volume, then it breaks and you have a crack propagation, and then it's like a catastrophic avalanche, and the material breaks or gives. So what if we wanted to control where it breaks? Because I'm absolutely sure the director will come back and say, oh no, I don't want physics. Real world is boring. I want that it breaks right in the middle. Even if it doesn't make sense, because it would not break in the middle, he wants to break it in the middle. And that's why we have this setup from the beginning I was talking about. We have this texture map. And it's a very simple texture map. I have a black stripe in the center, fading to left and right. So let me just prepare a little bit here so that I can show you what this means. We store the texture map values in the particles with our stress value. So we write out the texture map mono value. and stress of 0 or black color means that the particle is weak or soft, and 1 means it's the hardest value you can get. So with this 0 to 1 we can control weaknesses in the material we want to simulate. So we have to activate this in the data channel rollout menu. The input stress factor is coming from our data channel 0. The data channel 0 was set in the material group. So here we transfer our own pre-made stress or pre-made weaknesses in the material. So now we can define where the material should break, because we add extra weaknesses in our volume. And from these weaknesses you would get the crack propagation and the tearing apart of your material. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is show actually our gradient, because it would be nice to define to the spot where it breaks. So I use this debug dynamic set where I just use a viewport color and visualize the stress value. So the viewport color will override whatever we have before, and if I resimulate, we will see now our gradient is here. So I use, just for the sake of the tutorial, a very simple one, a gradient. So that lets me really control a fading area. So it's a kind of a softer weakness where the material is soft here, and the closer we make it, the more we can actually define a cracking line or a more hot area where the material is the weakest. So that's actually all it is. As I said, we did the little UV trick so that we can control where in the volume we want to have our gradient. And that's it. We define with our black and white values or gray values the amount of weakness in our material. And then all we need to do is start our simulation. But I'll turn off the debug so that we are back to our stress visualization. And now we can start, and let's just play it. So you've already seen on the right side, perfect snap in the middle, and also our torsion or twisting simulation right in the middle. It's really beautiful. So you can now control where the weakness in the material is. And it doesn't have to be a gradient. You can use whatever means. You can have random weaknesses in your material. You can have weaknesses in one corner, in whatever method you come up with. Let me just, for the sake of it, create a cellular material, and let me turn back on. I need to remember that our cellular, because it's tough to adjust it without seeing, because the scales are somehow different with procedural materials. So I'll turn on my debug dynamic set, and there we go. So I was not too bad with my size, but maybe I want not that little. I want just a little bit different size values, and maybe I'll play around with the contrast also a little bit, so that I have really strong parts, or the material properties set parts, and really weak areas. And now I want the opposite. So I want bigger weaknesses, but let me just connect the material or it will just fall apart. Let's just connect the materials a little bit more here, yeah, so that we get this kind of really strong parts in the material and the soft parts in the material. Yeah, something like that. I like this. So that looks good. Let's have a simulation and watch how this looks like. And with this kind of flexibility, you can create really amazing material properties. And you can see instantly on the right side, it looks really organic and natural, breaking apart. And also our twist is now looking much, much more natural and breaking apart. So That's it for this tutorial. I tried to make it as compact as possible. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and check out our other tutorials as well. Thank you so much for watching this video.